Okay, there we go.
Got-
That's great. Thank you.
I'll start again. So, hello, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Gary Gallagher. I'm the CEO of Optihall. Today's webinar is an introduction to Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. At Optihall, we provide route optimization software to the dairy industry. We typically deal with transport teams, supply chain teams, and more the people that we're speaking to are getting a knock on the door or an email or a call from their sustainability teams with a request to provide some data, some historical information around Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So we wanted to start the conversation to cover some of the basic topics in as simple as language as possible, and hopefully provide value to not just the types of people that we're speaking with, but anyone that is working in an organization where sustainability might not be their day-to-day job, but yet they will be asked to participate in sustainability activities and projects. So let's get started. So as I said, I'm the CEO of Optihall. We provide route optimization software for the dairy industry. We're specifically focused on one part of the dairy supply chain, which is farm to factory raw ingredient transport. But this webinar will cover all areas of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Now, thankfully, it's not just me you'll be listening today. We're delighted to have Dave Fitzgerald, who is a resident expert in this area, being a sustainability director at Ornua. Dave, I know you're still getting your camera set up, but hopefully you can say hello. And Dave, you'll just need to unmute there if you haven't already.
Yeah. Apologies there. Hello, everyone. I've had some internet trouble here today, so I've just joined from my phone. So hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yeah, that's perfect, Dave. Thanks very much. Okay, so let's get started. We've basically three different sections across these five agenda points. So the first part of the call is to explain what are these Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And some people will be much further along on their journey in reducing emissions than others, and some people may be just getting started. So we really need to take a step back and understand what these emission categories are. And to do that, we really need to understand where they've come from. So we'll do a 101 on greenhouse gases. We'll cover where the Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions came from. Then we will get some real-world insight into the work that Dave and Ornua have been doing along their emissions reduction strategy. So they have been successfully reducing emissions, and Dave is going to bring us through the hows and whys of all of that. Then we will narrow the focus down to milk transport, as many of you joining the call are responsible for that area, and obviously that is our area of expertise. And then we should be out of here right on the 30 minutes, the half past the hour. Okay, so what is greenhouse gases, or what are greenhouse gases, and where has the term come from? Well, any of you avid gardeners out there will be familiar with what a greenhouse does. And the real genius of a greenhouse is that on the one hand, it lets heat in from the sun's rays, so it takes in heat during the day. But on the other hand, it ensures that heat doesn't escape, so that it can maintain a consistent temperature when the sun has set. So the Earth works in a very similar way. Of course, the Earth doesn't have a greenhouse, but it does have a mechanism to take in heat when the sun is emitting heat, and to retain that heat so that it can increase the temperature of the Earth, so that plants can grow, animals can thrive, people can live. So that's where the term greenhouse gas effect has come from. And instead of using a greenhouse to maintain this heat and to hold the heat in Earth, we use the atmosphere. So very much like a greenhouse, the atmosphere takes in heat from the sun, and it retains that heat so that we can keep a temperature that allows us to live. And the gases that make up that atmosphere are greenhouse gases. They allow the sun's heat to pass through them, but then they retain the heat. Okay, so that all sounds great. And if you look at the natural greenhouse gas effect on the left, well, then it is great because heat is maintained, any excess gases are sequestered by growing and living plants and trees and so on. So from a naturally produced greenhouse gas perspective, then everything is working fine. But what has happened is that on top of those naturally produced greenhouse gases, we now have human produced greenhouse gases, or the human enhanced greenhouse effect. And that means that we are creating more greenhouse gases than are needed. That means that we are trapping more heat, and we are letting less heat escape into space. So the net effect of all of that is a term that everyone is familiar with, is increased temperature and global warming. So that's where the term greenhouse gas is coming from. That's the natural greenhouse gas effect. And of course, we have the human enhanced greenhouse gas effect. And that has brought many different efforts to try and reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to at least put a stall on that rise of temperature. So what are these greenhouse gases? So there are many. Probably the most talked about is CO2, carbon dioxide, because that is the primary GHG emitted through human activities. We probably have most likely we have an agricultural audience today, so we're very familiar with methane. Methane is produced from the production and transport of coal and oil, but it's also produced from livestock, also produced from waste landfills. Carbon dioxide is produced from burning fossil fuels. So carbon dioxide is the primary human created greenhouse gas, and that's why you'll often see CO2 or carbon CO2 emissions used interchangeably with the reduction of greenhouse gases. Okay, so that is the backstory. So who has done what? So there's an organization called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which sets globalized standards for GHG emissions accounting. It provides emissions inventories and ultimately helps corporates understand what sources of greenhouse gas needs to be measured and how they should be measured. And in 2001, the GHG protocol, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, devised a divide and conquer approach to managing these greenhouse gases. So it created a classification system to bucket different sources of greenhouse gases into different areas. So they came up with Scope 1, which are direct emissions from operations such as your own facilities or your own transport. Scope 2 emissions are indirect, so they are emissions coming from purchased energy such as electricity, gas, and so on. And then Scope 3 is almost a catch-all for all other indirect sources of GHG emissions, and that is emissions from parts of the value chain, the supply chain, purchased goods and services, and transportation, distribution of your product, whatever that might be. So these three categories were devised to make it easier for companies to address each of the different scopes with different initiatives, and also to make it easier for them to hold different parts of businesses accountable. It was thought that dividing the emission sources into these scopes will ultimately make it easier for companies to address them, track them, and reduce them. Okay, so from a dairy perspective and a dairy processing perspective, I mean, we'll all be familiar with some of the direct sources of emissions. So, you know, boilers, heaters, and dryers in owned facilities, refrigerants coming from fridges and refrigerators, the gases that are emitted from there, and owned transport vehicles. So anything that is owned from a facility perspective or from a transport perspective, and things that people are doing are, you know, upgrading their boilers and heaters. They're moving refrigerants to models that emit less refrigerant gases. They're moving to things like electric vehicles or biogas types vehicles. So they're the types of initiatives that companies are already doing to try and reduce their Scope 1 emissions, which are direct emissions. Then Scope 2 emissions, as we said, are emissions that come from purchased energy, and typically it's electricity for any automated machinery in your facilities, such as packaging, cooling systems, lighting, aircon. All of those types of purchased energy emissions fall into Scope 2, and things that people are doing, probably very obvious, is they're looking at things like LED lighting, installing solar panels, or installing wind farms to power their facilities. And then we have Scope 3, which is probably the most difficult, because as you can imagine, Scope 1 and 2 are relatively under the control of the reporting company, but Scope 3 are really more difficult to control and difficult to report on. And they include raw material transportation, which in dairy, the primary raw material is raw milk. The activities on the farm to produce the milk, obviously there's huge amount of innovation going on there to reduce emissions, packaging, using less packaging, or waste management. So that is not an exhaustive list. There are many sources of GHG emissions in Scope 3. But probably worth noting that for the majority of companies, Scope 3 makes up maybe 90+% of overall emissions, and Dave can probably validate that or not when he speaks, but maybe that is the point. So Scope 1 and 2 are probably easier to get a hold of because they're under the control, but Scope 3 can be seen as more difficult, but the flip side is that they make up a large majority of overall company emissions. Okay, so hopefully that was useful as an intro, as a 101 into what emissions are, and where these scope categories came from. Dave, as I pass over to you to take us through Ornua's journey in addressing these emissions, interested to hear your thoughts on, from a sustainability professional, on what you think of these categories. You've obviously gone through a period of trying to track and reduce these categories. Are they fit for purpose? Would you have done it another way if you were part of the GHG protocol in 2001? And then maybe also a second thing to add, Dave, is that while we have a lot of listeners from Ireland who will know who Ornua is for sure, and we do have some listeners from outside of Ireland who may not. So is as part of your presentation, if you could give an intro to Ornua, that would be a big help.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gary. And just checking again, you can hear me okay?
We got you. Yeah, thanks, Dave.
Perfect. Okay, so good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. So as Gary said, my name is Dave Fitzgerald. I work with Ornua. We're Ireland's largest dairy export business. We own the Kerrygold butter brand, which many of you may be familiar with, but we are also a global business. We have 16 manufacturing sites globally, in the US, in the UK, across Europe, and in the Middle East and Africa as well. So we have quite a broad value chain, and that's very relevant for the conversation today in terms of our emissions and how we calculate those emissions. So maybe if you want to move to the next slide. So it might be a little bit difficult to see here on screen, but I thought this graph would be useful just to give you some context around what emissions across our value chain look like and where they come from. So we've been measuring Scope 1 and 2 emissions for close to 10 years now for our manufacturing, and probably within the last 5 years, we've put a lot more focus on measuring Scope 3 emissions. So if you look at this particular graph, as Gary said, more than 90%, in fact, 99% in our case of our emissions are coming from Scope 3. So that's our value chain upstream and downstream, beyond our direct control, but obviously we have indirect influence and indirect relationships in terms of how we can influence that. Our manufacturing emissions, which are our Scope 1 and 2 emissions, are only 1% for our business. Now, this can vary depending on your business. Some businesses are very energy intensive in their manufacturing. Maybe their raw materials are not as carbon intensive, but in our case, the bulk of our emissions in our value chain comes from the ingredients that we buy, and that's primarily dairy ingredients that we buy from processors, and ultimately that they buy from farmers. So those emissions, if you look at our ingredients, where are those emissions occurring? Gary mentioned the greenhouse gases. So methane or methane, that's produced by a cow through natural processes. That's a significant greenhouse gas in our value chain. And then emissions from nitrous oxide, which is another greenhouse gas, which primarily comes from the use of fertilizer. So when fertilizer is used, for example, to grow grass, there are nitrous oxide emissions, which are also greenhouse gases. So they're the primary emissions at farm level for dairy production. If you look at our manufacturing, so our scope 1 and 2 emissions, scope 1 emissions are primarily coming from natural gas, which we burn in boilers to provide heat for our processes. So we use natural gas in our manufacturing process to generate steam. There's a small amount of scope 1 emissions come from what we call fugitive emissions, which are refrigerant gases that are used in our refrigeration plants. So obviously for cooling that we use in our process. And some of those gases, when they are inadvertently released, they leak from refrigeration systems. They're also considered greenhouse gases. So we have to measure and monitor those as well. And then scope 2 emissions, which is the electricity we purchase from the grid. And I'll just briefly touch on the other areas as well. So obviously transport and distribution, which is a key topic for this conversation. Upstream and downstream for us, 4% of our emissions are coming from third-party logistics associated with transport. So obviously transport within our own business that we own and operate would fit into our scope 1 and 2 emissions, but we don't operate our own transport. So it's scope 3 for us. It's in our value chain, and that's the fuel primarily used by those businesses, but also the electricity and gas or other fuels that they use in the running of their businesses, in offices, and those sort of locations as well. I might briefly touch on scope 1 and 2 because Gary mentioned that obviously we're on a journey here. So maybe if we could just move to the next slide. As I said, we've been measuring scope 1 and 2 emissions for close to 10 years now. And how do we calculate them? Every month we gather data on how much electricity we've used. We multiply that by an emissions factor that tells us how much emissions are associated with purchased electricity, which are scope 2 emissions. And then for scope 1, similarly, we measure how much gas, usually through invoices that we've used. And again, we convert that into greenhouse gas emissions. So that's primarily how we calculate our scope 1 and 2 emissions. We do that monthly, and obviously then we aggregate that for a year as well. So you can see the breakdown there on that graph between scope 1 and 2 for our business. In 2020, we set a target to reduce our emissions by 25% by 2025. We're on a program to do that right now. And how are we doing that? 2 ways primarily initially. One is energy efficiency. So obviously energy you don't use is the best energy because you're not paying for it. And also then you don't have carbon emissions associated with it. So that would be the first port of call for any business in terms of energy efficiency, cost reduction. It makes business sense to do it and hopefully reduce your emissions. But the challenge with that is if your business is growing, energy efficiency won't necessarily offset the growth in emissions from business growth. So you have to look beyond that. So the other area then you would look at in this space is renewable energy. So for us, we're on a journey around renewable electricity, which we've implemented on a number of our sites over the last number of years. And renewable electricity has 0 emissions and therefore reduces our scope 2 emissions. So you'll see from this particular graph, we've reduced our scope 2 emissions in 2022 and 2023. We're on track this year to have a significant reduction in our scope 2 emissions. And then we've budgeted for further renewable electricity in 2024 and in 2025. So that will ultimately get us to our 25% reduction target. So it's for scope 1 and 2, it's relatively straightforward. It's within your control. You measure it, you monitor it, you put programs in place to reduce it. There's some cost associated with renewables, which you have to factor in. It depends on, where you're located and, I suppose your purchasing strategy with the energy companies, but equally energy efficiency is around operational excellence, making sure you're running your business efficiently and managing your energy appropriately as well. Just briefly touch on scope 3 emissions. So what do we do about scope 3? So for us, obviously we've measured scope 3. We now know what our hotspots are. We need to work with our supply chain, and particularly our upstream supply chain. So there are dairy ingredient suppliers, for example, to understand what programs and targets they have in place to reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and ultimately what work they're doing with farmers to support farmers to reduce their emissions on farm. So while we can't directly manage to reduce those emissions, we can influence either through collaboration or through commercial incentives or penalties, as the case may be, our suppliers to work on carbon. And that's primarily how most businesses will engage on scope 3 with their suppliers. So we're on that journey right now. We have a very collaborative dairy sector here in Ireland. So we work together on emissions reduction, particularly on farm, and we support our suppliers who are working with the farmers on those programs as well. So I might stop there. I've obviously covered quite a lot. Maybe hand back to you, Gary, just in terms of the close out of the webinar.
Sorry, you're just on mute there, Gary. Sorry, I was saying to myself that interesting how you collaborate with your supply chain to address scope 3. I'm sure every company and every dairy processor and so on that is on the call, they also have to collaborate with their supply chain in turn for their supply 3 scope 3 emissions. So probably a very familiar. Very quickly, Dave, don't know whether you dodged it or forgot it, but what's your thoughts on scope 3, these scope categories in 10 or 20 seconds? Good, bad, indifferent?
I think we're on a journey. It's a misused phrase, but we're on a journey in terms of carbon accounting. Scope 1 and 2 emissions accounting, very clear, very straightforward. Scope 3 has improved significantly over the years. I think now with the new CSRD regulation in Europe requiring us to report our emissions publicly by regulation, I think there's going to be much more focus on the standards, on improvement of data quality and data sources. So a bit like financial accounting, there are standards out there. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the standard. It's the global standard. We need to work with that, and it will improve. Availability of data is improving all the time, which is also improving the carbon accounting. So I think still some work to do, still some uncertainty around some of the numbers, but improving all the time, I would say.
Super. Thanks very much, Dave. Okay, so to narrow the conversation slightly for the last few minutes, I wanted to talk about a specific part of the dairy supply chain, which we work in, and we work with a lot of our customers, is addressing emissions around milk transport or the transport of the primary raw ingredient in dairy processing, which is farm to plant milk transport. How customers are looking at this are, if they own the fleet, like we said, scope 1 is owned facilities, owned fleet. If they own the fleet, then this part of the emissions from the transport of milk from farm to factory falls into scope 1. And if they contract third parties to carry the milk, and then it's scope 3, because it's an indirect source of emissions. So what part does milk transport play in the overall emissions? Well, this is a very rough calculation, and I'll explain why in the next slide. But if we say that a million kilometers a year produces about 1,500 tons, and for those of you not using the metric system, then a million miles will be about 2,400 tons. But if we say that, and probably most of you will know how many kilometers you're traveling. If it's 5 million kilometers a year, then it's 7,500 tons. If it's 10 million kilometers, it's 15,000 tons. Typically that only plays a part of overall emissions, because the primary sources of emissions, as Dave was saying, is the production facilities and the on-farm emissions from cows and on-farm activities. So if you are a dairy processor with processing plants, then typically that could be anything between 5 and 10% of your overall emissions. If you are a marketing cooperative, which some of our listeners are, a model in the US whereby they collect the milk but sell the milk on to others to to manufacture and process, then this transport makes up a much higher percentage. And of course, for those larger milk haulers whose business is purely to haul milk, then milk transport makes up an even higher percentage of their overall emissions. So even if it's 10% or anything up to 50 or 60%, then it's still a significant portion of Scope 3 emissions which are created from milk transport. Now, how do you actually calculate emissions from milk transport? Well, I used a very crude calculation in the previous slide, but there really are multiple things to think about for transport teams if they want to get to an accurate calculation, and this applies to pretty much all transport emission calculations. So things like vehicle weight, whether it's loaded or unloaded, and that's if you can think of a milk collection operation where the truck is doing 4 or 5 runs a day, what percentage of that day is the truck totally empty, quarter empty, half empty, etc., etc. Those things need to be thought about. Of course, the truck engine needs to be thought about. In Europe, we have the Euro 3, 4, 5, and 6, and that all contributes to the amount of emissions. What type of vehicle it is, what type of roads the vehicle is traveling on, and what type of speeds the vehicles are going on. So for those of you in milk transport or who are going to get asked by your sustainability teams to which you will be, or if you haven't already, to really start to measure either transport from your own vehicles or transport emissions from third parties, well, then these are the types of things that you will need to start thinking about when you want to get to a much more detailed calculation of emissions. Now, what we found is that while milk transport can play a small or medium part in the overall emissions strategy, that it really does participate in many other wider ESG strategies. So almost all companies in dairy have a target for emissions, a self-set target to reach by 2030, and they'll be different by different country, regions, and so on. More and more, the carbon footprint from, let's say, milk, cheese, or whatever dairy product it is needs to be reported on. Wastewater management, and that's all part of milk transport, because of course the tankers need to be cleaned. Alternative fuel adoption and EV adoption, well, that will play a big role in any sort of logistics or transport operation, and then efforts to decarbonize the entire supply chain. All of that milk transport plays a big part in. Okay, so to finish, what are we doing with customers? Well, we are helping customers manage their emissions in this part of the supply chain by, first of all, digitizing their milk transport operations. It's very hard to report on this type of information if you have it on paper or Excel. We are helping them to reduce. Of course, the goal of all of this is not just to report, it's to reduce emissions. And how do you reduce emissions in transport? Well, you reduce the amount of miles you need to travel to perform the same operations. And so we're helping companies do that. And we're also helping companies now report on emissions. So whether they need to report weekly, monthly, year on year against the baseline, whether they need to report by specific geographies or specific haulers or specific subcontractors, whatever it might be. All of that is made possible by digitizing transport, reducing it, and then enabling your transport teams to report on it. Okay. So we squeeze it all into 30 minutes. Thank you very much for listening. Dave, thank you very much for joining. I thought it was very, very interesting to hear about your impressive efforts at Arnua. Wanted to leave with some useful resources which will be sent to you. So we mentioned the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, science-based targets, which many of you are already implementing as a way to validate the efforts against targets, and Pathways to Dairy Net Zero is a dairy-specific movement to get to net zero carbon emissions, which Optahall is a member and supporter of. Without further ado, we will say goodbye. Thank you, everybody, and speak to you on our next webinar. Thank you.